You know that person at work who never complains, never asks for help, gets the job done quietly, doesn't need a meeting about the meeting, and somehow already solved the problem before you finished explaining it? There's a good chance they're Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980. And what most people mistake for coldness or detachment is actually something far more interesting, a psychology built from the ground up by a childhood that didn't come with a safety net. Because here's what nobody tells you about Gen X. They didn't choose independence. Independence chose them. And understanding why changes everything about how you see the most overlooked generation alive. Let's go back. It's 1975. You're 9 years old. School ends at 3 p.m. and you walk home alone, because that's just what you do. You let yourself in with the key you wear around your neck. You make a snack. You do your homework. You watch TV, and you wait. Not because your parents don't love you, but because both of them are working, and the world didn't offer the kind of childcare options it does today. By 1984, researchers estimated that roughly 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. An entire generation, coming home to empty houses, learning the same lesson over and over without anyone ever saying it out loud. You're on your own. That lesson doesn't leave. It becomes a blueprint. Psychologists call this kind of environment a high autonomy upbringing. And when it happens during the key developmental years, it fundamentally rewires how the brain approaches trust, self-reliance, and emotional expression. The child who learns early that no one is coming eventually stops expecting anyone to come. Not out of bitterness, out of adaptation. The nervous system is incredibly efficient. It stops bracing for rescue and starts building internal structure instead. That's Gen X. They didn't become independent as adults. They were trained to be independent as children. And by the time adulthood arrived, they didn't even recognize it as a trait anymore. It just felt like reality. Now here's where the emotional guardedness comes in. And this part is important. Gen X didn't just grow up alone. They grew up watching the adults around them fail. Spectacularly, publicly. The divorce rates of the 70s and 80s didn't happen quietly. They happened in living rooms, at dinner tables, in arguments that kids weren't supposed to hear but did. Gen X watched their parents' generation preach stability, commitment, hard work, and then watched those same adults walk out, get laid off, fall apart. The psychological term for this is betrayal learning. When the people who are supposed to model the world for you turn out to be unreliable narrators of their own advice, something shifts in the brain's trust architecture. You stop taking people's stated intentions at face value. You start watching what they do instead of what they say. You build walls not because you're cruel, but because you've already run the experiment and you know how it ends. And then pile on top of that, Gen X children were largely raised in an era where emotions weren't a conversation topic. There was no language for feelings in most households. You didn't talk about being scared or sad or overwhelmed. You managed it. You pushed through. You figured it out. Emotional expression wasn't modeled because the generation raising them didn't have that vocabulary either. Research in developmental psychology is clear on this. Children who don't see emotions named and processed in their environment don't automatically develop that skill on their own. Instead, they develop containment, the ability to hold enormous amounts of feeling internally without it visibly surfacing. From the outside, that looks like being emotionally unavailable. From the inside, it feels like being functional. Gen X didn't shut their emotions down. They just never learned to open them up. Here's something that might make you see them completely differently. That emotional guardedness, it comes from a specific kind of intelligence. Gen X became experts at reading rooms. When you grow up in environments where adults were unpredictable, where a parent's mood when they walked through the door determined the entire evening, you develop hypervigilance as a survival tool. You learn to scan faces, read tones, sense tension before it surfaces. You get very good at knowing when something is wrong, even when nothing has been said yet. That's not coldness. That's a nervous system that did its job under conditions it shouldn't have had to face. And here's the twist that actually matters. Those same people, the ones who look emotionally unavailable on the surface, often feel things very deeply. They're just almost pathologically private about it. Because somewhere in childhood, vulnerability got associated with instability. Being soft meant being exposed. Being exposed meant getting hurt. So they learned to keep the soft parts hidden and lead with competence instead. This is also why Gen X has a complicated relationship with asking for help. For most of them, asking for help wasn't just discouraged. It was structurally impossible. There was no one there to ask. So they built an identity around not needing it. And here's where it gets psychologically dense. Identities formed in childhood survival mode tend to stick even when the survival context is long gone. A Gen X adult in 2025 who is struggling financially, emotionally, professionally, will often still default to the same strategy a 9-year-old with a key around their neck used. Handle it alone. Not because they're stubborn, because that neural pathway is the oldest one they have. It's the one that proved itself when nothing else did. Psychologists call this functional stoicism, the ability to continue operating at a high level under significant internal distress, without broadcasting that distress to anyone around you. It looks like strength from the outside, and often it is. But it can also mean that real problems go unaddressed for far too long, because to address them would require admitting a need, and admitting a need still feels somewhere deep in the nervous system, like a 9-year-old admitting they can't handle being alone. And yet, and this is the part that gets missed most often, Gen X is not a cold generation. Talk to a Gen X parent and watch what happens. Many of them have gone the complete opposite direction with their own kids. The emotional presence they weren't given. They pour into the next generation with both hands. They show up to every school event. They ask about feelings. They say, "I love you" out loud, because no one did it enough for them. They are fiercely, almost ferociously loyal to the small circle of people they've allowed past the wall. Because that's the other thing about emotional guardedness. When Gen X lets you in, they are in. That trust wasn't given easily. It wasn't given quickly. But once it's there, it's built on a foundation that almost nothing can shake. Because a generation that learned early what betrayal looks like doesn't let just anyone close, which means the ones who are close were chosen with extraordinary care. So what do you actually do with all of this? If you are Gen X, some of this might be landing somewhere uncomfortable. Because a lot of what kept you together for decades, the self-sufficiency, the stoicism, the walls, served you. They genuinely did. But those strategies were designed by a child living in a specific set of circumstances that no longer exist. You are not 9 years old coming home to an empty house anymore. You don't have to run the whole operation alone. The independence was never the problem. It's the assumption underneath it that help isn't coming, that vulnerability isn't safe, that asking means failing. That might be worth examining now, because you survived by being your own foundation. That took an extraordinary amount of strength. But foundations don't have to carry everything alone. That's what walls are for. And Gen X has built enough of those already. The most overlooked generation deserves to finally be understood, including by themselves. If this hit home, subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button. More coming.